أهلا بكم مشاهدينا الكرام إلى هذه الحلقة الجديدة من مستقبل الطاقة. هذه عناويننا. أوروبا تعجل بموعد حظر استيراد الغاز المسال الروسي، معلقة آمالها على التخمة المرتقبة في الإمدادات العالمية. وفي ظل الإجماع حول التخمة في سوق المسال العالمي في السنوات القليلة المقبلة، كم سيبلغ حجم فائض المعروض؟ وهل ستستطيع السوق استيعابه؟ بعد نحو 3 سنوات ونصف منذ بدء الحرب الروسية الأوكرانية، أقرت المفوضية الأوروبية حزمة العقوبات 19 على روسيا وطرحتها على الدول الأعضاء قبل نحو الأسبوعين. وقد تضمنت الحزمة حظر واردات الغاز المسال الروسي المتزايدة بدءاً من مطلع عام 2028. ومن المفارقات مشاهدين بأنه وبالرغم من تخلي أوروبا عن غاز الأنابيب الروسي إلى حد كبير، ازداد اعتمادها على واردات الغاز المسال الروسي، حيث أن روسيا اليوم هي ثاني أكبر مورد للغاز المسال إلى أوروبا بعد الولايات المتحدة. ففي عام 2021 بلغت حصة الغاز المسال الروسي من إجمالي واردات الاتحاد الأوروبي من الغاز نحو 4%، لترتفع هذه الحصة في 2022 إلى 5.3%، وفي 2023 إلى 6.2%، وفي 2024 إلى 7.4%. لكن في الأسابيع الأخيرة توالت مطالبات الرئيس الأمريكي ترامب للأوروبيين وغيرهم من الحلفاء مثل الهند وتركيا بتضييق الخناق على قطاع الطاقة الروسي، وهو ما دفع المفوضية الأوروبية إلى تعديل موعد بدء الحظر في حزمة العقوبات 19 إلى مطلع عام 2027، أي قبل عام كامل من الموعد المقترح سابقاً. وقد كان الاتحاد الأوروبي متلكئا في البداية باستعجال هذا الحظر، متخوفا من أثر ذلك على كلفة فواتير الكهرباء لمواطنيه، كما حدث عام 2022 بعد توقف تدفق غاز الأنابيب الروسي. لكن يبدو أن الاتحاد الأوروبي الآن بات أكثر قناعة بأن هذا الحظر المبكر مطلع عام 2027 لن يؤلمه كثيرا كما كان متخوفا منه، والسبب التوقعات المتزايدة بقفزة كبيرة في إمدادات الغاز المسال عالمياً في عامين 2026 و2027 تحديداً من كل من الولايات المتحدة وقطر. فمع دخول قدرات التسييل الجديدة خلال العامين المقبلين يتوقع المحللون تراجع أسعار الغاز عالمياً، مما سيدفع بشحنات أكثر من الغاز المسال نحو أوروبا، خصوصاً في حال لم يتجاوب الطلب الآسيوي بسرعة مع هذا الانخفاض السعري. لكن يحذر بعض الخبراء من أن الحظر الأوروبي للغاز المسال الروسي قد يخرج نحو 10.4 مليون طن سنوياً من الغاز المسال خارج السوق تماماً، وذلك لصعوبة إعادة توجيه الشحنات الروسية من محطة يامال تحديداً في القطب الشمالي، إعادة توجيهه إلى آسيا بدلاً من أوروبا بسبب كميات الجليد الأكثف في المسار الشرقي. وهذه الكمية المفقودة تمثل نحو 39% من إمدادات روسيا من الغاز المسال عام 2024. وبالتالي بالرغم من شعور الاتحاد الأوروبي بثقة أكبر بالإقدام على هذه الخطوة المبكرة في حظر الغاز المسال الروسي بسبب الفائض المتوقع في الإمدادات، إلا أن هذا الحظر قد يخرج جزءاً معتبراً من الإمدادات الروسية من السوق، والذي من شأنه أن يخفف من حجم المعروض والتخمة العالمية، وبالتالي فإن حجم الانخفاض التي تأمل إليه أوروبا في أسعار الغاز المسال العالمية في السنوات القليلة المقبلة من الممكن ألا يتحقق، وبالتالي قد ينقلب الساحر على الساحر. إذا مشاهدينا، إجماع بأن سوق الغاز المسال سيشهد فائضا هذا العقد في ظل حجم مشاريع التسييل التي ستدخل الخدمة في السنوات القليلة المقبلة. لكن كيف ستتعامل السوق مع هذه التخمة بعيد عام 2030؟ يبقى رهن حجم نسبة التراجع في الأسعار وسرعة استجابة الطلب له. هذا ما أكد عليه رئيس تحرير الغاز في Energy Intelligence هايمي كونشا في المقابلة التي أجريناه معا. لنتابع.
In this global gas and LNG scenario, there are two time periods that we have to consider here. Basically, what's going to happen between now and 2030 and what's going to happen after 2030. And we're pretty sure about what's going to happen by 2030. The oversupply that you mentioned will indeed occur because there are LNG projects that are already being constructed, particularly in the US and in Qatar. And by our estimates, this means that by either 2029 or 2030, about 625 million tons of LNG capacity is going to be basically the size of the supply aspect. And this compares to about 528, 530, give or take, of global demand being forecasted by then. This basically means that the supply-demand gap by the end of the decade is going to be somewhere between 90 million tons, give or take. And now what does this tell us about the market? This supply-demand gap will help to lower gas and LNG prices by 2030, and that basically sets the stage for what will happen after 2030. By 2030, we will expect that LNG prices across the globe will be in the single digits. In comparison, we are around $11 per million BTU at the moment. In the previous supply glut that happened, now about 5 to 8 years ago, prices went under $5. So as you can see, it's quite a significant drop. What happens after 2030, which was the second scenario that we need to consider, is a bit more uncertain. That's more difficult to talk about because these lower prices by 2030 disrupts the economic case for new projects. It makes these projects a bit more difficult, and it affects the upstream production of gas that is needed to supply those projects.
Jaime, maybe this is here my second question, where given the size, the potential size of the LNG glut by the end of this decade that you've just touched upon, will the market eventually be able to absorb it? And what factors would support this absorption? And how much time could that take until we draw down this excess supply that we are expecting end of the decade?
The short answer is that it is quite uncertain when the supply glut will be absorbed. And this is because it depends on many factors, particularly on the demand side. But as I said, the low price picture affects supply post 2030. As I was going to mention before, lower prices also incentivizes higher gas and LNG consumption. Sure. It incentivizes coal to gas switching. And it potentially creates more markets that didn't exist before, such as, for example, in the transport sector, in the maritime sector. That's on the positive side. So if that appears because of the lower price scenario, then the oversupply will be absorbed quicker in the next few years. However, on the other side of that picture, there's a lot of uncertainties. Because this demand force will not materialize. One of the big question marks, for example, is how much artificial intelligence data centers will absorb in terms of energy and power, policies and the pace of the energy transition, and how much renewables will compete with natural gas is also another aspect of it. And of course, there's the geopolitical aspect to everything that just creates a lot of uncertainties. The length of the war in Ukraine, a potential closure of the Strait of Hormuz, potentially affecting supplies coming out of Qatar, also becomes a big uncertainty. But the big question is, all things being the same, is how much new demand will be created or destroyed depending on the lower price environment.
Jaime, let's talk about policies and the coal to gas switching, particularly when it comes to one of the big demand centers of the last few years, the EU. The EU General Court upheld the Commission's classification of natural gas as a potential environmentally sustainable activity just this September the 10th. How significant is this in underpinning European demand for LNG, not only when it comes to energy security, but also in terms of emissions when it's related to that switching from coal to gas that you've referenced a little bit earlier?
Well, it is potentially positive for natural gas if the policy leads to the building of more natural gas power plants. However, in the European Union, natural gas demand as a whole is not expected to grow. And the role of natural gas in the European power sector is actually shrinking because of the increase in renewable capacity and renewable energy usage. So gas is needed. I'm not saying that it won't be needed. The question is whether it will grow, because gas is not a base load power source in the same way it was anymore, but it is now acting as a complement to renewables. If you talk about coal, I mean, gas will most likely than not take over the part of the market that was specifically covered by coal. However, that part of the market is being crowded out by renewables. And I'm talking here about solar and wind, but also about nuclear power and also hydro. That is natural gas as a whole, but specifically talking about LNG demand. In Europe, LNG demand is expected to remain strong into 2030 in any scenario, specifically because the EU is planning to ban the imports of Russian gas and LNG. And therefore, there will be a need to replace that amount of gas with any kind of source, but the most abundant source is LNG, and most likely from the US.
أهلا بكم مشاهدينا من جديد إلى مستقبل الطاقة. قامت الصين منذ مطلع أغسطس الماضي باستيراد 6 شحنات من الغاز المسال من مشروع روسيا الجديد Arctic LNG 2. هذا المشروع بدأ العمل في ديسمبر 2023، لكنه واجه تحديات في تصدير شحناته بسبب أنه يقبع تحت العقوبات الأمريكية والأوروبية. فكيف يمكن تفسير توجه الصين في الشهرين الماضيين إلى الاستيراد منه لأول مرة بالرغم من ضعف طلبها على الغاز ووفرة مصادر إمدادات أخرى؟ ضيفنا رئيس تحرير الغاز في Energy Intelligence هايمي كونشا يرى بأن الصين تحاول تحدي الولايات المتحدة وأن هذا يظهر ليونة ترامب تجاه موسكو. لكن سألته بداية كيف تؤثر المذكرة الموقعة الشهر الماضي بين الصين وروسيا لبناء خط غاز طاقة سيبيريا 2 على مشاريع الغاز المسال الأمريكية التي تنتظر القرارات الاستثمارية النهائية. لنتابع.
We still need to wait to see the details of the deal because the details of the deal, if one does emerge, will give us an impression as to how big the volumes that are to be expected to come into the market are going to be, and how large the relationship between China and Russia is going to be in the future. However, the signal that this memorandum for Power of Siberia 2, what it does signal is that China is likely not going to be a big competitor in the global market for US LNG. It will be, let's say, an opportunistic, price-sensitive buyer of LNG. What this means is that will likely create a bit more of volumes available for buyers in the Atlantic, particularly Europe. In terms of LNG projects awaiting FID, I do not believe that it will necessarily affect these projects directly, because we haven't seen Chinese companies overtly participating in signing new US LNG term deals for the last couple of years, at least not in a significant bulk. It seems that Chinese companies already have enough term US LNG, that is long-term supply of US LNG, in their portfolio, and it seems that they're not that interested in signing more. However, projects are affected indirectly, because if China is not absorbing these LNG cargoes, it means that the global supply glut, the supply flurry that you mentioned earlier, is likely going to take a little bit longer to absorb, which will depress global LNG prices, and that affects the economics of future projects.
And financing these projects. Let's move our attention, Jaime, to the near term. We have seen some 6 shipments to date from the Western blacklisted Russian Arctic LNG 2 project reach China since the beginning of August. Do you think this is a sustainable effort on the part of China to diversify its LNG sources, or is it more of testing the waters and maybe a little provocation to the Americans?
This to us is a very clear geopolitical signal, where China, to a certain extent, is saying we can buy these cargoes because we can. And basically daring the Americans to do something about it. Because to be honest, China this year in particular, out of all the years that we're talking about, China does not need these cargoes. This year, Chinese natural gas demand, and in particular LNG demand, is fairly weak. They have enough domestic, they have sustained domestic output, gas output, I mean. They have imports via pipelines from Russia. And industrially, the Chinese economy isn't exactly booming. So in particularly this extra demand for LNG is not really needed. And what this shows is, whether you believe that this is a provocation or not is beside the point. But what is important to consider is that the Trump administration in the United States has slowed or stopped the maintenance of its sanction programs and export controls related to Russian energy since coming into power. And sanctions, if they are not enforced, they're basically worthless. And, the meeting that Trump had with Putin in Alaska, for example, showed a willingness from Washington to engage with Russia on energy matters for the first time in many years. So, by not acting on the cargoes going into China, this might indicate as well that the United States will not engage in stopping these volumes going into China or other Asian buyers such as India. And if it does engage with other actors but not with China, this might mean that a bigger geopolitical shift here. But I guess the biggest question now is going to be that if these cargoes are indeed going to be allowed to be sold into Asian buyers, this allows Russian LNG projects to operate. And this means that there's even more supply into what is already a very oversupplied market, as we mentioned before.
Finally, Jaime, in the major gas conference, Gastech, earlier this month in Milan, what was very much eye-catching were the flurry of LNG deals that BOTAŞ, the Turkish state gas company, have signed. 8 deals in total, ranging from 1 to 3 years, with a total of around 6 BCM. How would you read into this Turkish activity?
So BOTAŞ, which is the state gas importer of Turkey, is basically building for itself an LNG portfolio for term volumes, and it's mainly for two very important reasons. One, they are moving away from buying LNG on a spot basis, which tends to be extremely volatile and expensive. Long-term contracts tend to be a very relatively more stable price, and it's ensured that they receive the volumes on a stable manner. And the other factor is that buying more LNG strengthens the negotiating position of BOTAŞ and Turkey as a whole ahead of the expiry of long-term pipeline gas contracts with Russia and Iran, which are expiring next year. The Russian contracts, for example, are for over 20 billion cubic meters per year of natural gas. And it seems that what Ankara is thinking about is that they expect, most likely than not, because they like to diversify their supplies, they will likely renew the contracts with Russia, but most likely for a lower volume and a lower price if possible. And having more LNG available makes their argument much more stronger. And, it's quite a significant amount of deals. It's over 20 BCM, and this allows them to not only diversify, as I mentioned before, but any excess cargoes or any excess volumes that are available to BOTAŞ allows them to potentially re-export them into the European Union, which of course needs as much gas as they can. Or potentially they can also act as a trader and resell them into the global market. So for BOTAŞ, it's a win-win proposition because they meet domestic demand, and when they don't meet domestic demand, they can export the excess volume. So it's a good opportunity for them.
نهاية مشاهدينا حلقة مستقبل الطاقة، نلقاكم الأسبوع المقبل. إلى اللقاء.